In the previous episode of this series, Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty, we explored how Egypt became fragmented into various political factions, with the most prominent being the supporters of the Libyan families that we today know as the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. Such divisions made Egypt more susceptible to attack from outsiders. But one dynasty from well beyond the Nile's first cataract would eventually reunify Egypt and spark a resurgence of traditional Egyptian culture and religion. These Kushite kings, hailing from the lands between the 3rd and 5th cataracts, temporarily restored Egypt to its position as one of the greatest powers of antiquity. That is, until the arrival of the military juggernaut from the east, known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. First, let's get a grip on Nubia and its inhabitants. Nubia is a region that historically extends from Aswan in modern Egypt 800 kilometers south to the area around modern Khartoum, Sudan. It's a land characterized by scorching heat, arid conditions, and little to no rainfall during the summer months. The Nile River flowing through Nubia is unnavigable in several areas due to a series of cataracts, where the river's flow is interrupted by incursions of igneous rock into the sandstone bedrock. These cataracts make sailing the Nile in Nubia extremely difficult. By 5000 BC, many began transitioning to a more settled life focused on farming and animal husbandry. Several complex cultures had also developed in Nubia, with the earliest dating to around 3800 BC and called by archaeologists the A group. In the following centuries, B and C groups would also appear. Compared to other areas of the world during the latter years of the 4th millennium BC, most outsiders would have considered Nubia to have been rather poor. However, it was rich in gold, useful minerals, ebony, and other resources, which is why the Egyptian kings to the north sought to control as much of the land and its people as possible. The earliest written evidence of an Egyptian incursion into Lower Nubia likely dates to the reign of the first dynasty king, Jer, between 3000 and 2900 BC. However, it was not until the Middle Kingdom period, specifically during the reigns of the 12th dynasty kings around 1900 BC, that a substantial and sustained Egyptian presence in Nubia became a significant aspect of daily life. By the time of one of their most powerful rulers, Senusret III, Egypt's southern border had been formally extended into Nubia to just beyond the Nile's second cataract, which encompassed the large area known as Wawat. The Egyptians looked down upon their Nubian subjects and saw them as little more than a nuisance that had to be harshly dealt with. One inscription of Senusret III sums up his attitude towards them. The Nubian listens to word of mouth. Answering him is making him retreat. If one shows aggression toward him, he turns his back. But if one retreats, he will act aggressively. For they are not respectable people. They are wretches with broken spirits. My person has seen them. It is no lie. Statements similar to this one were often propaganda against what was becoming Egypt's great nemesis in the south, the Kingdom of Kush, whose capital, Kerma, was just beyond the Nile's third cataract. Following the end of Egypt's 12th dynasty, the Egyptian military presence in Nubia greatly diminished due to internal political issues within Egypt, and by 1700 BC, most, if not all of the fortresses in Lower Nubia were under Kushite control. In fact, the tables had turned so decisively that now it was the Kushites who were raiding the frontiers of Egypt. Later Egyptian inscriptions and texts would often complain about vile or wretched Kush. It was during the centuries of the New Kingdom period, from 1550 BC onward, that the trajectory of Nubian history and the character of its people would change forever. These centuries saw Egyptian control of not only the vast majority of Nubia up to the Nile's Fourth Cataract, but also the thorough Egyptianization of Nubian society. Nubia during the Egyptian New Kingdom period had become the most important part of the expanding Egyptian empire due to its gold and valuable natural resources. Because of this, the new position of Viceroy of Kush was created to oversee the Nubian territories on behalf of the pharaoh. Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs established and heavily invested in new towns and cities across from existing Nubian ones, gradually depopulating the latter due to their inability to commercially compete with the better financed and more dynamic Egyptian settlements. This happened at Kerma, where the ancient center was abandoned in favor of the new commercial town of Dukigel, barely a kilometer away. So-called temple towns were also established, many at pre-existing sacred Nubian sites. At these sanctuaries, the power and prestige of Egyptian royal cults, such as that of Amun, were projected upon the Nubian population far and wide. As time went on, and Egypt's political power and influence became entrenched within Nubian society, Nubian elites adopted Egyptian customs, culture, clothing, and religion. This doesn't mean that there was no resistance or insurrections against Egyptian rule, but after the Kushite kingdom centered around Kerma was obliterated in 1500 BC, opposition was never strong enough to significantly challenge Egyptian authority in Nubia. However, political problems and internal decline within Egypt eventually loosened the pharaoh's grip on the territory. By around 1050 BC, Nubia appears to have regained its independence, with Egyptian armies retreating north of the traditional border at the Nile's First Cataract for the last time, never to return. By that time, 5 centuries of Egyptian rule had deeply integrated Egyptian culture, customs, and religion into Nubian society. This influence is comparable to the impact of Spanish language, culture, and Roman Catholicism on countries with their own indigenous cultures, such as Mexico or Peru. Even though some documents and inscriptions from Thebes still mention the title Viceroy of Kush until around the year 750 BC, there's little to no evidence of any Egyptian political influence over Lower Nubia and the lands south of the First Cataract after the 11th century BC. Most Egyptologists believe that these were simply symbolic or ceremonial titles that were devoid of any real power. Archaeologists have also come to the conclusion that Lower Nubia, between the First and Second Cataracts, had been depopulated, with its shrines and towns being all but abandoned for centuries. It's possible that some so-called viceroys of Kush, in theory, oversaw these areas, but again, evidence of a sustained Egyptian presence there has yet to be discovered. There is, though, plenty of documentation of Nubian mercenaries serving in Egyptian armies during that time. Much more information is available regarding events in Upper Nubia from the time of the Egyptian withdrawal around 1050 BC and the 3 centuries that followed. It seems that local rulers were once again in control of Nubia, with the main political and economic centers being the cities of Kerma and Napata. Later records indicate that by around 750 BC, nearly all of Nubia had been united by a family from Napata. Often called the Thebes of Nubia, Napata was strategically located near the Fourth Cataract and controlled the main overland route that cut from the Fifth to the Third Cataract. It was also at the foot of an approximately 100-meter tall rock outcrop known today as Jebel Barkal. The Barkal area had been conquered during the reign of Thutmose III around 1450 BC, after which a series of temples, including a large one dedicated to Amun, was built there. The city that later arose in the area became known as Napata, and the main temple was dedicated to a local form of Amun known as Amun of Napata, who had the head of a ram. After the Egyptians left, Napata and the temple at Gebel Barkal became the dynastic home and spiritual capital of the Nubian kingdom of Kush. Based on findings in the nearby royal cemetery of El Kuru, this Napatan dynasty was in existence since at least 850 BC, but unfortunately, there are no names associated with the earliest tombs that have been discovered there. The earliest ruler whose name we know from this line of kings was Alara, who may have ruled as far north as the Third Cataract. His successor, Kashta, seems to have presided over all of Nubia and perhaps even parts of Upper Egypt, as an inscription from Elephantine, the historic border between Egypt and Nubia, reads, "The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nimare, son of Ra, lord of the two lands, Kashta, living forever." We don't know the details of how this happened, or even when, since Egyptologists have come up with different dates and chronologies, but it is agreed that it was partly due to the problems and political disunity within Egypt itself. Between 750 and 730 BC, Egypt had effectively been divided into several polities ruled by families of Libyan descent. The most prominent of these were the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, based in Tanis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt, respectively. However, other parts of Egypt, though they may have officially sworn allegiance to one of these two houses, were in reality de facto independent. Such divisions presented an opportunity for outsiders such as the Kushites to reach further north into what had previously been exclusive zones of Egyptian influence. While some in Egypt may have considered the Kushites outsiders, if not invaders, the kings of Kush thought of themselves as the opposite. Since the decline of the New Kingdom and the subsequent incorporation of many Libyan and Canaanite practices into Egyptian society, it was the Kushites who preserved many of the ancient religious and cultural traditions of Egyptian civilization in Nubia. They continued to worship and build temples for traditional Egyptian gods, especially Amun. They also maintained many Old and Middle Kingdom practices, such as constructing pyramids and other buildings using classic Egyptian styles and techniques. Furthermore, they upheld the age-old tradition of a strong, centralized government with the king, or pharaoh, at its head, which, up until recently, had been a cornerstone of Egyptian society since Narmer united Upper and Lower Egypt over 2,300 years earlier. Kashta's successor was Pianky, also known as Piye. He most likely succeeded Kashta around 750 BC, but the extent of his dominion, at least during the earlier parts of his reign, is uncertain. Later inscriptions make it seem as if he may have controlled Egypt to just below the Fayoum oasis. Pianky seems to have associated himself most with both Thutmose III and Mentuhotep II. Thutmose III was technically the founder of Napata and had left a stela that was still there in Pianky's time. As one of the most celebrated rulers of the New Kingdom, he must have left quite an impression on Pianky. The other, Mentuhotep II, had reunited Egypt 150 years after the collapse of the Old Kingdom. On a stela from Gebel Barkal, dated to his third regnal year, Pianky, aka Piye, had the following inscribed. "The son of Ra, Piye, beloved of Amun, says, Amun of Napata appointed me to be ruler of every foreign land. The one to whom I say, you are chief, he becomes chief. The one to whom I say, you are not chief, he does not become chief. Amun in Thebes appointed me to be ruler in Egypt. Each one to whom I turn my attention, there is no way to plunder his town, unless it be by my hand. Gods make a king, men make a king, but it is Amun who made me, the one whom the leaders did not make. The kings that Pianky is referring to are the chieftains and petty rulers that by his day were present all over Egypt due to the unprecedented political fragmentation that had plagued the country. Around the same time that Pianky was extending his influence further north, the rulers of Sais, a city in the western delta, began rallying the Libyan fiefdoms and petty states of Lower Egypt, including the kingdom of the 22nd Dynasty kings in Tanis, to confront the Kushites. By 730 BC, a local dynasty named Tefnakht became the ruler of Sais and gradually extended his influence further east into the Nile Delta. He's also the first of two kings recognized by Egyptologists as belonging to Egypt's 24th dynasty. Once again, civil war had returned to Egypt. On one side stood a coalition of Libyan chiefs and petty kings, while on the other was a Nubian from Napata, claiming to be the rightful pharaoh of all Egypt. Much of what we know about this crucial time in Egyptian history comes from a 159-line inscription on a monument known as the Victory Stela of Piye. Nearly twice as long as the poem on the Battle of Kadesh, commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses II, many have called the words on this monument Piye's epic, since its author was clearly educated in the language and vocabulary of Middle Kingdom literature. At the head of the stela is a depiction of Piye before the god Amun and his consort, Mut, receiving the submission of the defeated rulers of northern Egypt, who were all identified by name. The text of the stela describes how Tefnakht of Sais had expanded his domain south beyond Memphis and secured the allegiance of Nimlat, Piye's now former vassal and the ruler of Hermopolis. Their combined forces then headed south to take the city of Herakleopolis. Piye's inscription is quite long, but parts of it read, "One came to inform his person that the Prince of the West, Tefnakht, had seized the entire west from the coastal marshes to Lisht, sailing south with a great army, the two lands being united in following him, the mayors and rulers of compounds being dogs at his heels. No fortress of the nomes of the south had closed their gates. Every town in the west had opened its gates in fear of him. He had turned back against the nomes of the east, and they had opened to him. He was closing in on Herakleopolis. He had surrounded it without allowing anyone to leave or enter, fighting every day. But these chiefs, princes, and generals who were in their cities were sending word to His Majesty daily, saying, 'Nimlat, ruler of Hermopolis, behold, he has gone to be a subordinate at Tefnakt's heels, having shrugged off his allegiance to His Majesty. He stands with him just like one of his followers, while he, Tefnakht, gives to him rewards as his desire dictates, from among everything that he has found.'" The text continues and describes how Pianky ordered two of his commanders in Egypt, Pewaram and Lamersekni, to lay siege to Hermopolis, while another Nubian army advanced from the south to support them. Soon afterward, the Kushite army and its allies engaged many enemy troops and successfully defeated them before pushing onward to Hermopolis. There, Nimlat, along with the 22nd Dynasty king, Usorkan IV of Tanis, Iuput II, the ruler of Leontopolis, and several other Libyan chiefs and their troops, met them for battle. Pianky's Victory Stela tells us, "The fleet was captured on the river. The remnant crossed over, mooring on the west bank. At first light, His Majesty's army crossed over against them. Army mingled with army. Then they slaughtered many men among them and innumerable horses. Trembling arose among the rest, and they fled toward the northland from the great blow. King Nimlot fled southward when told that Hermopolis was confronted by the hostility of His Majesty's army, and entered Hermopolis while His Majesty's army was on the riverbank. The Kushites laid siege to Hermopolis and sent word to Pianky back in Napata, who was upset that despite sending so many men, the city and his enemies had still not capitulated. Before going to Hermopolis, Pianky stopped in Thebes to celebrate the New Year and Opet festivals, during which his armies fought on, capturing more towns and killing one of Tefnacht's sons in the process. Finally, Pianky arrived outside of Hermopolis, where we're told, "He made for himself a camp at the southwest of Hermopolis, keeping a stranglehold on it daily. A platform was erected to elevate the archers when shooting and the slingers when slinging stones, slaying the people among them daily. Days passed, and Hermopolis became foul to the nose, deprived of its ability to breathe." Unable to withstand the Kushite attack, Hermopolis eventually surrendered. Envoys brought out items made of gold and precious stones, including Nimlot's crown, to be given to Pianky. After this, Nimlot's wife, daughter, and all of the women of his harem came out to beg for mercy. Finally, Nimlot himself came out, surrendered, and offered Pianky his finest horse. After thanking the gods for his victory, Pianky visited Nimlot's stables. Due to his fondness for horses, he was enraged when he saw that they were malnourished, and is reported to have told Nimlot, "How much more painful it is for my heart that my horses have been starved than any other crime that you've committed at your discretion." After the fall of Hermopolis, the siege of Heracleopolis was lifted, and its ruler, who had remained loyal to Pianky, came out to greet the Kushite king with gifts. Pianky and his men then marched further north to take several towns in Middle Egypt before arriving at Memphis, Egypt's historical capital and the most important city in the north. It was there where several rebel kings and leaders, such as Euput II, Akanosh, chief of the Ma, and Prince Pedieset of Athribis, were holding out. Pianky is said to have offered the following terms: "Don't shut yourselves in. Don't fight. He that would enter, let him enter. He that would come out, let him come out. Those who would depart shall not be hindered. I shall give an offering to Ptah and the gods of Memphis. I shall sail north in peace, having left Memphis safe and sound." However, the gates of Memphis not only remained shut for Pianky, but an army was sent out to meet his. That night, Tefnakht arrived at the city, and rallied its population to hold fast against the Kushite king. Having witnessed Pianky's men lay siege to Hermopolis for months, the leaders of Memphis had prepared the defense of their own city by stockpiling food and strengthening its fortifications. After inspecting his men, Tefnakht mounted his horse and headed back north into the delta to summon more reinforcements. It wouldn't be enough. That night, Pianky's navy took every available ship and used their masts to scale the walls of Memphis, ultimately taking the city and slaughtering or capturing numerous enemy troops. Euput II, Akanosh, chief of the Ma, and Prince Pedieset of Athribis came out to surrender to the Kushites. Later on, more cities and their leaders, including Osorkon IV of the 22nd Dynasty, submitted to Pianky as the Kushite army marched into the delta. Along with their tributes of gold and cattle, many of them gave the Kushite king fine horses, as by now they had heard just how much he loved them. Finally, Tefnakht sent a messenger to Pianky to sue for peace. Piye's victory stela tells us the following. Then the chief of the Ma, Tefnakht, sent a messenger in fawning supplication to the place where his majesty was, saying, "Be appeased. I cannot look upon your face in the days of shame. I cannot stand before your flame. Cleanse your servant of this fault. Let my property be received into the treasury, of gold and every precious stone, even the foremost of the horses. Let a messenger come to me quickly, that he may drive fear from my heart. Then I shall go to the temple in his presence, and cleanse myself by holy oath." With Tefnakht and the other kings and chiefs of the Delta swearing oaths of loyalty to the Kushite crown, Pianky and his men soon departed for Napata. He may have now in practice been the pharaoh of all of Egypt, but he preferred to spend his time back home in southern Nubia. While there, he spent his time and wealth building up the city of Napata and its temples. He was content to leave the kings who had fought against him in power as long as they didn't challenge his authority. This, though, would prove to be a great mistake. Not long after Pianky left for Napata, Tefnakht reneged on his promise of fealty to Kush, adopted full royal titles, and even expanded his domain to include Memphis. By 718 BC, Tefnakht was dead, and his son, Bakenrenef, succeeded him as king. By now, Pianky must have been rather old, and perhaps didn't have the energy nor the resources to launch a new campaign to subdue Middle and Lower Egypt for the second time. Some have wondered if this may have been the initial reason why he left Lower Egypt without a sizable garrison. Regardless, by 712 BC, the great Kushite king, Pianky, was dead. When exactly Pianky died and how long he reigned is debated. The popular chronology devised by Egyptologist Ian Shaw puts the years of his reign between 747 to 716 BC, but the newer one, formulated by scholars such as Egyptologist Aidan Dodson, puts Pianky's time on the throne to the years between 750 to 713 BC. Both of these put his reign at over 30 years, which was a long time for any Egyptian ruler. Dodson's chronology also takes into account the most recent evidence that has led many Egyptologists today to conclude that Pianky's son, Shabataka, also commonly known as Shebetiku or Shabitko, succeeded him. Previously, it had been widely accepted that Pianky's brother, Shabaka, was his successor. So, the succession we have now is Pianky, his son Shabataka, and Shabataka's son, Shabaka. For our purposes here, I'm going to use Aidan Dodson's chronology for the 25th dynasty. Pianky may have been content to live out the remainder of his days in Napata and leave Middle and Lower Egypt in the hands of the minor Libyan kings, chiefs, princes, or whatever title they preferred to call themselves at the time. But Shabataka wasn't having any of it. According to the later 3rd century BC historian Manetho, it was perhaps Shabataka, who he calls Sabakon, who may have had Bakenrenef burned alive. Whether or not this story is true can't be confirmed, and there are few surviving monuments of Shabataka describing any northern Egyptian conquests, but one inscription of his brother, the future king Taharqa, alludes to gathering an army from Nubia to reconquer parts of the north. A section of the inscription reads, "Now, when Taharqa was in Nubia as a handsome youth, a king's brother, sweet of love, he came sailing northward to Thebes in the midst of recruits, for whom His Majesty, King Shabataka, true of voice, had sent to Nubia, in order that he, Taharqa, might be there with him, because he, Shabataka, loved him more than all his brothers." Bakenrenef ruled for just 5 to 6 years before he was either killed or deposed. Between the years 720 to 716 BC, there must have been a lot of fear in Lower Egypt. Many of the small kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean coast had become unwilling vassals of the ever-expanding Neo-Assyrian Empire. The ascension of Sargon II to the throne in 721 BC eventually triggered a series of revolts throughout the empire, including in the region historically known as Canaan. One of these areas was in Philistia, which was a confederation of the 5 Philistine cities of Ekron, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Philistia and its cities were crucial to Assyria for 2 main reasons. One is that they served as the primary conduit for trade between Western Asia and Africa, and 2, it acted as a buffer between Egypt and the ever-expanding Assyrian Empire. Therefore, it was essential for Assyria to maintain control over these Philistine cities. Just 3 months after Sargon II became king of Assyria, Ilubeidi, the ruler of Hamath in modern Syria, incited the Assyrian vassal kingdoms of Arpad, Simira, Damascus, Taharqa, and Samaria to revolt. Taking inspiration from this, the following year, in 720 BC, and with Egyptian support, Hanunu, the king of Gaza, declared his city's independence from Assyria. Sargon's reprisal was swift, and perhaps that same year, Hanunu and his allies were defeated. One of Sargon's inscriptions that mentioned this campaign, and specifically how the king of Egypt aided Hanunu, reads, "He, the king of Egypt, ordered his general, Rei, to go to Hanunu's aid and do battle and fight against me. At the command of the god Ashur, my lord, I defeated them, and Rei, like a shepherd whose flock has been stolen, ran off alone and disappeared. Hanunu I seized with my own hand, and I took him to my city, Ashur, in chains." The name of the Egyptian ruler isn't stated, but many believe that it was most likely Usurkan IV of Egypt's 22nd dynasty, who technically would have still been a vassal of Pianky, although some believe that he, like Tefnakht, may have declared his independence from Napata by then. This later hypothesis is plausible, considering that in 716 BC, Sargon mentions in an inscription that an Egyptian king named Shilkani, who scholars believe is likely Usurkan IV, sent him 12 great horses whose like did not exist in Assyria. This may have been either to deter the Assyrian king from invading Egypt, or perhaps as a gesture of goodwill with the hope of forging an alliance against the Kushites. A few years later, in 712 BC, a certain Iamani seized the throne from Assyria's puppet king of Ashdod. He then attempted to incite other kingdoms in the region to revolt against their Assyrian overlords. Iamani's rebellion failed, and he fled to Kushite-controlled Egypt, whose ruler at the time, according to Sargon II's inscription at the site of Tangi Var, was Shabataka. In Akkadian, his name is written as Shabataku. The part of Sargon's text mentioning these events reads, "I plundered the city of Ashdod. Iamani, its king, feared my weapons. He fled to the region of the land of Nubia and lived there like a thief. Shapataku, king of the land of Nubia, heard of the might of the gods Ashur, Nabu, and Marduk, which had demonstrated over all lands. He put Iamani in chains and handcuffs. He had him brought captive into my presence." As far as we know, Shabataka didn't have an extradition treaty with Assyria, so why would he have given up Iamani? In another of Sargon's inscriptions from Khorsabad, the site of the ruins of his one-time capital of Dur-Shurukin, he all but makes clear that the Kushite king would be punished for harboring Assyrian fugitives. "The king of Nubia, who in the land of Erizu, an inaccessible place, whose forefathers from the distant past until now had never sent their express messengers to the kings, my forefathers, in order to inquire about their well-being, heard from afar of the might of the gods Ashur, Nabu, and Marduk. The awesome splendor of my majesty overwhelmed him, and panic overcame him. He put him, Iamani, in handcuffs and chains, fetters made of iron, and they brought him on the long journey to Assyria and into my presence. According to Dodson's chronology, Shabataka died around 705 BC, the same year as Sargon II of Assyria. Shabataka was succeeded by Shabaka, also known as Shabako, who may either have been his son or the brother of Pianky. There's still disagreement about this amongst scholars. Along with Shabaka, there was another new ruler in the Near East, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria and son of Sargon II. In 701 BC, Sennacherib launched a new Assyrian campaign into the eastern Mediterranean, specifically against Phoenicia, Philistia, and the kingdom of Judah. His annals tell of how Ekron's pro-Assyrian ruler, Padi, had been overthrown and handed over to King Hezekiah of Judah. In the ensuing battle, Sennacherib claimed that Egyptians and Nubians were among the coalition that fought against him. He tells us, "On the plain of El Tike, they sharpened their weapons while drawing up in battle line before me. With the support of the god Ashur, my lord, I fought with them and defeated them. In the heat of battle, I captured alive the Egyptian charioteers and princes, together with the charioteers of the king of the land of Nubia." That unnamed Nubian king must have been none other than Shabaka. Sennacherib captured Ekron and reinstated Padi, the Assyrian-appointed governor, who had been Hezekiah's prisoner. His forces then plundered 46 Judean towns and laid siege to Jerusalem. One passage from the Hebrew Bible's Book of Isaiah, which may or may not have been based on an actual quote by an Assyrian official named Rabshakeh, mentions the Kushite alliance with Hezekiah and Judah. "There you are, relying on that broken reed, Egypt, which pricks and pierces the hand of the person who leans on it. That is what Pharaoh of Egypt is like to all who rely on him." The Hebrew Bible says that the siege of Jerusalem was lifted by an angel of the Lord that killed 185,000 Assyrians. The large numbers of dead Assyrians are not believed by archaeologists, but many scholars do think that the angel of the Lord may have been a reference to a plague that spread throughout the Assyrian camp, forcing them to withdraw. Another explanation is that matters in Assyria compelled Sennacherib to return to Nineveh. Other scholars suggest that a settlement may have been reached between Sennacherib and both Judah and Egypt, because the latter two are recorded in both Assyrian records and the Hebrew Bible as paying tribute to the Assyrian king. Evidence of a settlement between Egypt and Assyria may come from a seal impression bearing Shabaka's image, which was found in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The seal may have been part of Egypt's tribute to the Assyrians after the siege of Jerusalem. Shabaka died in 690 BC, his 15th year as king. He was succeeded by Taharqa, the son of Pianky and the brother of Shabataka. Taharqa is arguably the most famous of all Kushite pharaohs. At the age of 20, Taharqa left Nubia to bring an army to Shabataka in Egypt, until he himself became king. He's also famous for sponsoring night races that ran from the Pyramid of Isesi at Saqqara to Fayum. Taharqa was also the most prolific builder of the 25th dynasty and well known for his numerous construction projects and monuments that spanned across Upper and Lower Egypt, giving him the name the Builder King. For nearly a decade and a half, Egypt seemed to prosper and be at peace under Taharqa's relatively benevolent rule. During that time, in 681 BC, Sennacherib was assassinated, and a brief civil war took place that ended with his son and chosen successor, Esarhaddon, becoming the Assyrian Empire's new ruler. As in the past, when there was trouble on the Assyrian throne, many provinces, especially along the empire's eastern periphery, wavered in their allegiance to the crown. By 734 BC, Esarhaddon's armies seem to have restored order, but they may have overextended themselves by venturing into Egypt, as a Babylonian chronicle records. The 7th year. On the 5th day of the month Adar, the army of Assyria was defeated in Egypt. 3 years later, in 671 BC, new rebellions broke out in the Levant, prompting the Assyrians to return in full force. This time, Egypt and its allies were not so fortunate. Esarhaddon's annals record his victories against Taharqa, part of which read, "In the course of my campaign, I set up fortifications against Baalu, the king of Tyre, who trusted in his friend Taharqa, the king of Kush, threw off the yoke of the god Ashur, my lord, and kept answering me with insolence. I cut off the supply of food and water that sustained their lives. As for Taharqa, the king of Egypt and Kush, the accursed of their great divinity, from the city Ishhupri to Memphis, his royal city, a march of 15 days overland, I inflicted serious defeats on him daily, without ceasing. Moreover, with regard to he himself, by means of arrows, I inflicted him 5 times with wounds, from which there is no recovery. And as for the city of Memphis, his royal city, within half a day by means of mines, breaches, and my ladders, I besieged it, conquered it, demolished it, destroyed it, and burned it with fire. I carried off to Assyria his wife, his court ladies, Ushanahuru, his crown prince, and the rest of his sons and daughters, his goods, his possessions, his horses, his oxen, and his sheep and goats, without number. I tore out the roots of Kush from Egypt. I did not leave a single person there to praise me. Over Egypt, all of it, I appointed new kings, governors, commanders, customs officers, trustees, and overseers. I imposed the tribute and payment of my lordship on them, yearly, without ceasing. Among the new kings, governors, commanders, and other officials Esarhaddon appointed was Nekhau I of Sais, the progenitor of Egypt's 26th dynasty. He's also known as Necho I, but more on him later. Assyrian control of Egypt was tenuous at best, and by 669 BC, Taharqa had taken back Memphis and much of the southern delta. This prompted Esarhaddon to march back to Egypt, but on his way there, he died. He was succeeded by his son, Ashurbanipal. For Taharqa, though, Esarhaddon's death was only a temporary relief. In 667 or 666 BC, Ashurbanipal launched a new, full-scale invasion of Egypt, and this time there was no respite. The mighty Assyrian king tells us of the destruction he wrought on the kingdom of the Nile. Taharqa had forgotten the might of Ashur, Ishtar, and the great gods, my lords, and put his trust upon his own power. He turned against the kings and regents whom my own father had appointed in Egypt. He entered and took residence in Memphis, the city which my own father had conquered and incorporated into Assyrian territory. A fast messenger came to Nineveh to report to me. I became very angry on account of these happenings. My soul was aflame. I lifted my hands, prayed to Ashur and the Assyrian Ishtar. I called up my mighty armed forces, which Ashur and Ishtar have entrusted to me, and took the shortest road to Egypt and Nubia. Quickly, I advanced as far as Karbaniti to bring speedy relief to the kings and regents in Egypt, servants who belong to me. Taharqa, king of Egypt and Nubia, heard in Memphis of the coming of my expedition, and he called up his warriors for a decisive battle with me. I defeated the soldiers of his army in a great open battle. Taharqa heard in Memphis of the defeat of his army, and the splendor of Ashur and Ishtar blinded him, such that he became a madman. He left Memphis and fled, to save his life, into the town of Thebes. This town I seized, and led my army into it to stay. The kings, governors, and officials whom my own father had appointed in Egypt, and who had left their offices in the face of the advance of Taharqa and had scattered into the countryside, I reinstalled in their offices and in their seats of office. I reorganized Egypt and Kush, which my own father had conquered. I made the garrisons stronger than before, and ordered new regulations. With many prisoners and heavy booty, I returned to Nineveh. The most complete and graphic details about Ashurbanipal's conquest of Egypt come from inscriptions such as this, as well as records from the Assyrian state archives. We must remember, though, that these are Assyrian sources and don't give the Egyptian view of events. There is almost no account from the Egyptian side of what happened, just mentions of the country being overturned and repelling enemies from the southern nomes, the latter being a reference to a possible Assyrian withdrawal from the south, something which Ashurbanipal seems to have confirmed in another inscription. Afterwards, all the kings whom I appointed broke their oaths and did not keep the agreements sworn by the great gods. They forgot that I had treated them mildly and conceived evil. They talked of rebellion and came among themselves to an unholy decision. And they sent their mounted messengers to Taharqa, king of Kush, to establish a treaty. Let there be peace between us, and let us come to a mutual agreement. We will divide the country between us. No other lord will be ruler over us. My officers heard about these matters, captured their mounted messengers with their messages, and learned about their rebellious doings. They arrested these kings and put their hands and feet in iron cuffs and fetters. These kings who had repeatedly schemed, they brought alive to me in Nineveh. Many of the rebel kings and other leaders were put to the sword or flayed, with their skins nailed to the walls of subdued cities. The exception was Nekau I of Sais and his son, Psamtik, who, though they may have also rebelled against the Assyrians, were spared and even honored by Ashurbanipal in the hope that they would prove to be loyal vassals of the Assyrian regime and a bulwark against Taharqa's forces further to the south. As for Taharqa, he died in 664 BC in Thebes. His body was taken back to Nubia and buried in a small pyramid tomb in what became the Nuri cemetery near the Nile's fourth cataract. He was succeeded by his nephew, Tanutamun. Tanutamun was the son of Shabaka and one of Taharqa's sisters named Kalhata. He seems to have wasted no time in attempting to take back Lower Egypt from Ashurbanipal. In a text on what's known as the Dream Stela of Tanutamun, we're told, "In the first year of his appearance as king, his majesty saw a dream in the night. 2 snakes, one on his right, the other on his left. His majesty woke up, but did not find them. His majesty then said, 'Why has this happened to me?' Then reply was made to him, saying, 'Upper Egypt is yours. Seize Lower Egypt.'" Tanutamun journeyed from Napata to Thebes, stopping along the way to make offerings at various temples. He then came to Memphis, where he likely faced the forces of Nekhau I of Sais, the now staunch vassal of Ashurbanipal. The inscription on the dream stela continues. His Majesty arrived at Memphis. The children of revolt then went forth to fight with His Majesty. His Majesty made a great slaughter among them. His Majesty captured Memphis. He was seated in his palace, devising with his heart a plan to cause his army to surround them by an earthen talus. Nekhau I is believed to have died in that encounter, with Psamtik taking his place. Tanutamun may have ultimately been victorious had Ashurbanipal not sent more forces to crush the rebellion. This time, the Assyrians would not fail, as Ashurbanipal tells us in one of his inscriptions. He, Tanutamun, called upon his soldiers to attack my troops, the Assyrians stationed at Memphis. He surrounded these men and cut off all escape routes. A fast messenger came to Nineveh and told me about this. On this, my second campaign, I marched directly against Egypt and Nubia. Tanutamun heard of the approach of my expedition and that I had set foot on Egyptian territory. He left the city of Memphis and fled into Thebes to save his life. The kings, governors, and regents whom I had installed in Egypt came to meet me and kissed my feet. I followed Tanutamun and went as far as Thebes, his fortress. He saw my battle array approaching, left Thebes, and fled. From Thebes I carried away booty, heavy and beyond counting. I made Egypt and Kush feel my weapons bitterly and celebrated my triumph. With full hands and safety, I returned to Nineveh. Any Egyptian kings and princes who had previously remained neutral now recognized Ashurbanipal as their ultimate overlord. The Assyrians made it all the way to Thebes and plundered its temples, which Ashurbanipal claims contained silver, gold, precious stones, linen garments with multicolored trimmings, and 2 solid cast electrum obelisks standing at the door of the temple. It's likely that Psamtik of Sais and his men fought alongside the Assyrians, which only cemented his status as Ashurbanipal's main Egyptian vassal. Tanutamun is believed to have returned to Napata and never come back to Egypt, the land that he and his immediate forebearers had fought so hard for. Tanutamun could take solace in that he still ruled the sizable kingdom of Kush, but it must have been a significant psychological blow to realize that he and his descendants would never again rule Egypt as pharaohs. Fate, though, was much more kind to Psamtik and his descendants. Choosing to side with Assyria would pay off, especially when the latter's influence within Egypt retrenched and ultimately dissipated between 615 and 610 BC. The line of kings starting with Nekhau and continuing with Psamtik and his descendants is known to us today as Egypt's 26th dynasty, which we'll cover in the next episode of Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, Grant XXIV, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, WenXTV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Frank, Tim Blaine, Sebastian Otado Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, David R, Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Dianastra, Nimrod Nir, Hypnosan, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sherkam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.